What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Warden tank. So the Warden tank still remains one of the stronger tanking specs in the game, probably second in line, only next to Nightblades and right below Dragon Knights when it comes to kind of how strong they are in endgame PvE content. Warden tanks have gotten a series of buffs as well as a series of nerfs over ever since they were first introduced in Morrowind. But right now they're in a pretty good spot. They have quite a few pretty good group buffs that they're able to provide. They have some pretty decent tankiness, and their self-heal has gotten quite a bit of change over the last few patches, but is and has been kind of in a good place now when you compare it to something like Green Dragonblood. So a Warden tank is definitely something you're going to see a lot of in endgame PvE trials, probably swapping out here and there with Nightblade tanks depending on the exact group composition that your group might need. So for example, if you have a Nightblade tank, you might see a Warden healer instead. If you're running a Sorc healer with a Templar healer, then you might see a Warden tank instead if you're running a Magicka heavy group, for example. But Wardens are definitely here to stay in the endgame PvE community here. So just like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any gear in this video. So if you want to know exactly what gear a tank should be running, you can go ahead and click on the upper right hand corner. There should be a link to the tank gear video up there. So you can go ahead and pause this video, check out that video, and then come back here. This video will be taking a look at skills, what sets Warden tanks apart from other classes, and the general philosophy behind tanking in ESO. So let's go ahead and get started with skills. So starting off with our front bar here, we have Pierce Armor. This gives you the Major Fracture and Major Breach. You can go with the other morph of Pierce Armor, which is Ransack for the minor protection, but Warden tanks do have a native source of minor protection, so it might not be necessary for you to run Ransack. Ransack also drops that Major Breach, so you're only able to use this if you have consistent elemental drain uptime from your healers, or perhaps as a tank. Next we have Heroic Slash, a staple for tanks for the Minor Maim and Minor Heroism. We have our Self-Heal, which is Polar Wind. This has been changed quite a few times over the last few patches, but it is in a pretty good spot right now. So it'll instantly heal you and another ally for a percentage of your health, so I believe it is about 20% of your health, maybe 15% of your health. Plus it also heals an additional percentage of health over 5 seconds. So overall, pretty good healing. Not going to be quite as strong as Green Dragonblade when it comes to burst healing. This is more for kind of topping yourself off and just making sure that you have the heal over time going before you take heavy damage. It's still a good burst heal, but again, it doesn't really compare to Green Dragonblood on a DK tank. These next two abilities are flex spots, so you can replace these abilities with other abilities as you see fit. The first ability here is going to be Gripping Shards. This is for the CC, the immobilization for 3 seconds. This is cast on you, so you can't throw it out and immobilize enemies in front of you. So just keep that in mind. Frozen Device is the second CC ability, and this basically acts as the Warden's versions of Chain. So this basically pulls enemies in. The portals do have a kind of an arm time, so very similar to Rearming Trap, where just because you put it down doesn't mean it'll activate right away. It does take a little bit of time to do so. It also immobilizes them for 3 seconds, so this can double as a immobilization as well. However, it does require the person to be ported over, so you can't actually use this on things like bosses and elite mobs. It also has a nice effect of dealing Major Maim, which might be beneficial to help reduce overall damage, but again, because you won't be able to portal in the big mobs, which are generally speaking going to be more dangerous, the Major Maim is not going to be all that useful, or at least it's not as useful as it potentially could be. One benefit of this is that because it is essentially a ground AoE, you can place this ahead of time if you know where ads are going to spawn, and that way you can pull them to you. That being said, it is not an infinite range, so if you put a portal down and you move, let's say, 40 meters away, it actually won't port them to you. You still have to be within that 28 meter radius in order for the portals to actually port things to you. And for ultimate, we have the Bear ultimate, but we're obviously not going to be using this as a primary ultimate. There is a passive under the Animal's Companion line known as Flourish, which gives you an additional 12% magic and stamina regen. So that's why we're using Eternal Guardian here for the additional magic regen that we get from Flourish. Then on our back bar, we are running a staff back bar. We have Inner Rage for our taunt. balance for the Major Resolve as well as the Magicka Sustain. You can replace this with the Warden ability, either Ice Fortress or Expansive Frost Cloak. This is the source of minor protection that I mentioned earlier. Ice Fortress does provide you with minor protection, so you can choose this, or if you want to hit multiple people with Major Resolve, then you can run Expansive Frost Cloak instead. But the additional magic sustain that you're getting from balance can't really be discounted. Then we have, this should be a Blockade, not Unstable Wall, for the longer duration. But if you're running a bow back bar, then you will be running Endless Hail for the enchant procs. So this will just help proc your enchants on the back bar. Then we have Bull Netch for the stamina return. It also has a cleanse effect as well, so it removes one negative effect from you every 5 seconds. So if you need a self purge, this is definitely the skill to run. You should be running this anyways for the stamina sustain though. And you have another flex spot here, which I'm running energy orbs on. As a Warden tank, it's always beneficial to have some form of heal for the group, and so Energy Orb really kind of fits that mold there. And that's just to help proc the minor toughness passive that you get from the green balance passive, Maturation. So Energy Orb is really great for healing other people, and also provides the combustion synergy for additional sustain as well. Then our ultimate is obviously Aggressive Warhorn for the major force. Now, in terms of other abilities you could slot, particularly on these two ability slots or the back bar ability, you will definitely want to have at least one healing ability, an AoE heal, so something that can heal other people, whether that be something like Vigor, minor lifesteal, something like that. But quickly going down the line here, Deep Fissure or Subterranean Assault. Which one you run is going to be dependent on your group, and also whether or not you have any Necromancers running Unnerving Boneyard. So if you're running, for example, a stamina-heavy group, you can run Subterranean Assault for an AoE Major Fracture, unless you have a Necromancer running Unnerving Boneyard, which also provides Major Fracture. So this is a kind of situationally useful tool here for the AoE Major Fracture or Major Breach. You can't do both at the same time, so kind of fit whichever one to your group. Next we have Fetch Infection or Growing Swarm. Both of these will be used for the minor vulnerability that it applies on the dot. So the actual damage itself, while it is beneficial to have some extra damage, is obviously not the primary reason to be using this. This just helps out with minor vulnerability uptime. It is going to be a little bit tricky to maintain. It is a 10-second dot, so you can pretty much treat this more or less like Engulfing Flames on a DK, obviously with a different debuff. But this is definitely a skill you want to kind of talk with your support roles. If you have a Warden healer, for example, it might be better for them to run Fetch Infection, particularly if they're running Zen's Redress, because that'll also help with the uptime on Zen's Redress. Then we have Deceptive Predator, which you'll be slotting for the minor evasion, which reduces damage from area of effect attacks by 10%. A little bit of additional damage mitigation never hurts, so it's always nice to have that option there. Plus, if you do activate it, you gain Major Expedition for 6 seconds, and movement speed might be beneficial depending on the specific trial that you are running. So definitely have this skill on hand, just in case you want additional movement speed or survivability. Under the green balance line, Budding Seeds is great for an additional synergy. It is relatively cheap to run. It also helps proc minor toughness and Symphony of Blades if you're running that, but it's mainly used for additional harvest synergy that it can provide. If you have a Warden healer, then you don't need to run this ability because your Warden healer will be running Budding Seeds. But if you are the only Warden in the group, then Budding Seeds helps provide that harvest synergy to help Lakesti's Major Slayer uptime. Other heals that might be beneficial to run would be Enchanted Forest for a burst heal. It's pretty decent, especially if you're kind of caught on your own. You have to self-sustain. The heal is pretty strong for a burst heal. Not quite as strong as Polar Wind, but the heal over time after it is going to be obviously a little bit stronger. Plus you get some additional ultimates if you heal somebody under 50% health. The other healing moves on this line are all pretty decent, and they have their niche uses. So, for example, Fungal Growth, if you run Enchanted Growth, you can get Minor Intellect and Minor Endurance, which is helpful. Living Trellis or Leeching Vines, both are potentially useful here. I personally prefer Leeching Vines because it does apply Minor Lifesteal. However, there are better ways to apply Minor Lifesteal rather than using Leeching Vines. Lotus Blossom or Green Lotus, doesn't really matter which one you choose. Both of them have the same effect of causing light and heavy attacks to heal allies or you. Not a very strong heal, and I personally wouldn't necessarily recommend running this either on a tank or a healer, just because the heal is random or somewhat random, and it's a very small heal, so not really worth running. And then the only move that you probably won't be running would be Nature's Grasp, just because it pulls you to other people and you don't need that mobility as a tank. Under the Winter's Revenge line, we already talked about Ice Fortress as a source of major resolve and minor protection, but you also want to pay attention to Shimmering Shield, which is really useful if you're fighting bosses with projectiles. It is the only consistent source of major heroism in the game, so Wardens do have the potential to have some very high ultimate generation in fights where you have a lot of projectiles coming out. The damage that it absorbs is really strong. In Cloudus, for example, it can fully absorb Zamaja's heavy attack, no issues at all. So definitely an ability I would recommend having on hand if you're anticipating projectiles, because it does give you that major heroism for better Warhorns, better Warhorn uptime. Moving on from there, under the Sword and Board line, you have Defensive Posture, both Absorb Missile and Defensive Stance. The only one that's really worth mentioning is going to be Defensive Stance for additional block mitigation. Absorb Missile is decent for some additional self-heals. It's kind of up to you whether you want to run it or not. Polar Wind will typically speaking be enough. The advantage of running Absorb Missile is it also helps absorb some damage as well. So you get the damage as well as the heal, so you can pretty much combine them together to get as the effective amount of health you'd be getting if you were running Absorb Missile. If you're running a bow backbar, I recommend taking a look at Venom Arrow as a ranged interrupt. For Destruction Staff, your equivalent ability would be Crushing Shock. You also want to potentially pick up Elemental Drain for the minor Magicka Steel. Usually a healer will be running it, but there might be instances where it'll be better to put it on a tank rather than a healer, so just have this in your back pocket in case your healers aren't running Elemental Drain. Under the Armor line, the Heavy Armor ability, Immovable or Unstoppable Brute, are both situationally useful because of the immunity to knockback and disabling effects that it provides. Just be mindful that when you do use this ability, it does reduce your movement speed. So with 5 heavy armor, you will have a 90% snare on you. With 7 heavy armor, you will have 100% snare, so you won't be able to move at all outside of dodge rolling. Under the Fighters Guild line, you might want to pick up Ringer Preservation for the minor protection and the small heal that it provides. Really useful in situations where you guys are going to be stacked up for any sort of execute phase. For example, Lacasti's hard mode, assembly general, final execute phase, for example, would be situations where you would use Ringer Preservation. Because Frozen Device does have an arm time, sometimes you want to pull things immediately to you. That's when you would use Silver Leash instead of Frozen Device. So you can really pick whichever one you want to run. The danger with Silver Leash is that because it uses stamina, you will need to be mindful of how often you use it, because you want to maintain enough stamina in order to block attacks. Under the Psijic Order line, Deep Thoughts or Introspection are potentially good moves here. They are channeled abilities, so you will not be able to block while you are channeling them. You can raise your block, but it will cut off the ability. This just returns health, stamina, and magicka back to you. So you will get some mitigation while you have it, so you will get Deliberation, which gives you major protection. But again, you won't be able to block without dropping it, so just be mindful of when you activate this ability. Overall, this is a pretty good sustain tool here, so you can actually use this, drop, bounce, and run something like Ice Fortress to get your major resolve and minor protection that way. Speaking of minor protection, you could also just run Temporal Guard, which will give you minor protection while you have it slotted. And finally, actually not finally, you kind of want to have all these abilities unlocked here under the Undaunted line, so you want Overflowing Altar for the minor lifesteal. You're going to want Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy, obviously Iterate for your range taunt. Then you have Bone Surge for the Major Vitality bonus that it provides. Make sure to get Bone Surge and not Spiked Bone Shield. Major Vitality is situation useful depending on the specific fight. And then obviously Energy Orb is the preferred morph of Necrotic Orb, just because it does provide a heal, which helps proc your minor toughness. Then under the Alliance War line, Echoing Vigor for a self-heal as well as an AoE heal to help proc that minor toughness and Symphony of Blades. Also stacks with other sources of Echoing Vigor, so you can actually get quite a few stacks of Echoing Vigor going with stamina heavy groups and get a ton of healing going. Under the support line, you already have the self-cleanse with your Bull Netch, but it only cleanses one effect every 5 seconds, so if you need a more immediate purge, you will want to run Efficient Purge, and also obviously purges things from the group as well. And then if you want to run a more group utility oriented ultimate while not giving up too much magicka regen, you can run Reviving Barrier. This will help provide a shield out to anybody within the radius. Plus, if you have the Magic 8 passive, it also gives you some additional magic regen while you have it slotted. So that covers pretty much all the skills that you're going to want to run on a Warden tank. Now on to discussion of tanking. So what sets Warden tanks apart is obviously the source of minor vulnerability. Only one other tank has that class minor vulnerability, and that's going to be the Nightblade tank. So that's kind of where Wardens stand in terms of unique debuffs with minor vulnerability. The one advantage that Nightblade tanks have over Wardens is that their application can be an AoE application, so it's better for trash fights. But Wardens getting that additional minor vulnerability makes them a little bit more useful, and it also allows you to drop Infallible Aether on a healer so you can run another set, maybe a sustain set or something, to help out group sustain. Warden tanks also can provide minor toughness, which helps improve overall survivability. All you have to do is just heal somebody, so that's why we are running energy orbs. You can also run any other healing ability, so something like Vigor or Overflowing Altar, for example, that applies minor lifesteal. All of those will help proc minor toughness, which will help your overall DPS survivability. Beyond that, Warden tanks themselves can build to be fairly tanky because they do have a source of minor protection that is class. Class is a class ability, so it's a little bit easier to obtain, arguably speaking. But with that regard, Warden tanks with the minor vulnerability and minor toughness, they do have a kind of good leg to stand on when it comes to tanking. There is an argument, obviously, that minor toughness can be better applied with a Warden healer, and that minor vulnerability is better applied via the Nightblade because of the AoE application. But a Warden tank can still do both jobs decently well. It might be a little bit harder, but it is still a potentially good option here. Warden tanks also have a pretty decent self-heal as well. Not all classes have a strong self-heal, so for example, Templars don't really have a decent self-heal, for example. So that does kind of give them a little bit of a leg up compared to some other classes. But more and more classes are getting more bursty self-heals, so that advantage is sort of falling to the wayside here. DKs are still going to have the strongest burst self-heal with Green Dragonblood, but Polar Wind is pretty strong nonetheless. One of the other major advantages of running a Warden tank is the fact that you have a Chains ability that costs Magicka to use. Pretty much the only class that has this same sort of functionality is the DK tank with Chains. So in that regard, Warden tanks are beneficial that way. So you don't have to run something like Silver Leash in order to pull enemies towards you, so you're able to kind of get a better sustain on your stamina that way. But Warden tanks, again, they might not necessarily have all the kind of bells and whistles of some other tanking classes, but their overall their general toolkit, their general survivability, all lend them to be a pretty solid tank for endgame PvE content. For tanking in general, for those of you guys who come over from other MMOs, the primary job of a tank still remains the same. You're still taunting things, you're still trying to stay alive, just keep things off of your allies. One of the main differences between other MMOs and ESO is that ESO does not have an AoE taunt. So for things with multiple ads to pull in, that's going to be your job to kind of maintain crowd control. So that's where Gripping Shards come in, Frozen Device, to help pull enemies in, keep them off of your DPS, and immobilize them. That way they can all get burned down by your AoEs from your DPS. And the other thing that's going to be a little bit different from other MMOs is the fact that tanks in ESO are expected to help provide additional DPS for the group. That comes from buffs you're able to provide for your allies and debuffs that you can provide to the enemy. So for example, the Alkosh debuff reduces enemy resistances to help provide some additional damage that way. If you're running a Warden tank, you can give allies minor toughness, minor intellect, minor resolve, all of which help out DPS survivability or DPS sustain, both of which should help out indirectly their overall DPS. Plus, there are some other sets that you can run that also provide buffs to the group. For example, Perfected Yolnahkriin for minor courage. So that's kind of the primary difference behind tanking here, and that's kind of what separates out good tanks from great tanks in endgame PvE content, the ability to manage your debuffs. So if you're a Warden tank, obviously you want to make sure to know the fight mechanics, know how to survive, you know when to dodge roll, things like that. But once you have mastered that, that's when you want to start shifting over towards maximizing buff and debuff uptime. So getting really good Alkosh uptimes, getting really good minor vulnerability uptimes with Veteran Infection, and so on. So that's kind of the hallmark of a great tank. That's what raid leaders are looking for in their tanks, those debuff and buff uptimes. So again, once you mastered kind of the tanking part of the tank, that's when you want to move over it and focus in on mastering the support role of a tank as well. So for those of you guys who are interested in Warden tanking, I do have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel in a Warden tank position, so you guys get an idea of how I play my Warden tank. Some of them are a couple patches old, but the general premise still remains the same. You can also just check out other tanking videos on my channel. The general philosophy behind tanking is pretty much consistent across all classes. It's just swapping out what skills you are running, and maybe a couple of gameplay changes because Wardens might be a little bit less survivable than DK tanks because you don't get as much mitigation. At least as much block mitigation, I should say. But that concludes this video. If you guys have any questions about the build, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hopefully you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.